First of all, can I just say cheers, everybody? I don't know what each one of you is drinking, but that's the only thing I'll ask you to keep clean. And, you know, cheers to all of us staying relatively vertical in this time of utter disarray. I must say my head is spinning insofar as so much it feels is unraveling. And maybe that's just because I spend far too much time online, not necessarily on social media, I will tell you, but just reading, watching, listening. And, you know, I know that I've got to get more stringent about taking breaks from news and current affairs. That said, it is with news and current affairs that I begin our chit-chat. If you attended the first and previous chit-chat, you know that I spoke about Russia and Ukraine. Turns out that that was the very day that Russia invaded Ukraine. And as I always remind folks, correlation is not causation. Tonight, I'd like to begin with something perhaps even more contentious, particularly to a North American audience. And that is the issue of abortion. Now, I want to say straight off the bat, what I'd like to discuss is not political. It is not ideological, in my view. It's about empathy and humanity. And empathy and humanity for those who regard themselves as pro-choice and those who regard themselves as pro-life. When the draft Supreme Court decision about what to do with Roe v. Wade leaked, I didn't jump into the fray on social media. I reflected, and I reflected and reflected. And I decided that the one post I would offer about this issue would be the story of my mother. Jen, could you bring up this first slide?
Yes.
Here's the tweet. My mother had an abortion because my dad said he'd kill her if she gave birth to another girl. Mom could not bear the thought of leaving her 3 existing daughters to this so-called man. She still begs forgiveness from her dead child. So here's a sincere question for pro-life peeps. Is my mother a criminal? Don't bring up the next slide just yet, Jen. In response, and boy, did I get a lot of responses, most people who had a crystal clear answer said that my father is a criminal. And I happen to agree with them. But for those who tried to answer the question, is my mother a criminal? Only 2, 3, maybe 4 said yes. The vast majority said something along the lines of, I've got to think about this more. And that's precisely the response I was hoping for. I'll tell you why in a moment. Late in the whole tide of responses, I received a tweet that I'd like to share with you now. On to the next slide, Jen. He writes, she should have forgiveness, and I am sorry for your family's terror. You must have all suffered under that so-called man. I have most always been pro-life, but I see the need for abortion in some cases and to prevent death due to self-abort attempts that kill the mother. Life is precious. And it's not so much because of his empathy, that I was moved by this tweet. It's because it struck me as the most consistently pro-life response that I received. That he recognized that the dead child, and my mother does believe she killed her child, not her fetus, her child. Galen, the author of this tweet, recognizes that life is not just about the dead child. It's also about the woman who carried that child. And this is the kind of nuance that doesn't take anything away from anybody's position, but instead recognizes that life is rarely purely black or purely white. That even when it comes to as polarizing an issue as abortion, the nuance, the struggle, the pain involved for both lives has to be acknowledged if we're going to be able to keep our positions without destroying one another. I know a man who regards himself as very conservative, supporter of President Trump. And in his younger years, he got a woman pregnant and he paid for her abortion. He openly acknowledges this to me, but he won't say it within his own tribe. I know a woman who denies that abortion is ever used as birth control, but she used it as birth control. She would never admit this, even in her own tribe. My point is this: it's when we don't acknowledge the struggles that we artificially make these issues and our positions absolute. And this is one of the reasons I'm such a huge fan of telling stories. You can spew facts and logic and stats all you want, but they are empty of humanity. They are abstract. They're anemic. They are bloodless. Stories are full of life, if you'll forgive that phrase, because they are rich with complexity. And nobody can take away your story or that of someone you love. So my opening soliloquy this evening is that I hope you remember, as you engage with people about any issue, however polarizing, that you are passionate about, find a way to tell a meaningful story. And that'll be much more powerful as a conversation opener, as distinct from a confrontation opener. It'll be much more powerful and will give your other the permission to go there too. With that, I would now like to throw it open to your questions about anything. And Jen, if you would please bring me back up on screen. I'll just remind you that it's always more engaging for me to hear a question voiced by you, so that I know who's asking it, and I can actually ask a question of my own and perhaps clarify your intention that way. If you can't bring yourself to voice a question, feel free to put it into the chat. Jennifer or Allison, two of my team members, will be sure to bring it to my attention. But if you can voice your question, I'd appreciate it. So hands up, who's got a question? And Jen, Allison, if I'm not seeing someone, but you are, please do let me know. I do see Rosalind.
Does it have to be about the abortion issue?
Oh, not at all. No, not at all.
Okay, well, I'm still going to ask it. I'm going to piggyback on yours because I was thinking about it. I find myself often polarized within myself. So what I try to do is actually talk to myself in stories. I find it actually helps, as opposed to just reading someone who affirms how I currently feel at the moment. But I'd like to say this. I have a question. To anyone here who is anti-abortion in this call, why is it that anti-abortionists care for a fetus inside a woman's body, but once it's outside of the body, they don't seem to care? For me, there's an inconsistency there. So it seems to be you're pro-life inside the woman's womb, but they're not pro-life outside of the womb. So that's my question. Why the inconsistency?
Feel free to engage, whoever would like to.
Hi, Irshad.
I guess I would.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Maliha. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody there. I'm here in New York. I just wanted to thank you for holding this. As soon as I saw the Eventbrite, I signed right up. I said, "There's no way I'm missing this." I just wanted to say, as a mother, I now have a 3-year-old daughter. I just hit 40. My pregnancy was the worst thing I've ever been through. The post-pregnancy was also extremely trying. I had postpartum depression as well. There are so many factors. I mean, I guess I'm piggybacking off of Rosalind's comment and question, but there are so many things that I waited a long time before having a child. I waited till 37. And I knew it'd be a trying experience, but nobody really recognized what it does to the mother and how our bodies change forever, how our lives have changed forever. And I'm so happy to have such a wonderful, healthy child. But at the same time, you can't help but feel I can't, the whole Roe v. Wade as of late has made me very upset, because if somebody forced this tragic experience I had, I could go through the gamut, but nobody wants to hear my horror story. But if it's just shocking to me as a woman, as a parent, as a mother, as someone who just had to go through so many health issues for something that, sure, I wanted this, but God forbid I didn't. And it was forced upon me, and for whatever reason, or it wasn't my choice. And it's just really sad, because I couldn't imagine I still can't imagine having a man tell me how to feel and what to do and how I should do it. If they don't know how, what we go through, what your mom went through, what all parents really struggle with. I mean, it's not just a fetus, a child, of this. I mean, you have a full responsibility for the rest of your life. Coming from an animal lover, also it's very much the same thing. Once you start, you have to see it through. You don't just give the cat away when the kitten's not cute anymore. Which happens a lot, actually. But I just wanted to share just my experience and how much this has personally touched me, along with a lot of the things, obviously, that you could mention that's going on in the world right now. And yeah, I don't want to take up time, so I'll stop.
Thank you, Maliha. Another, instance of humanizing the issue through the sharing of a story. Thank you so much. I am curious if anybody here has an answer for Rosalind's question. And I'll repeat the question. Why does it seem that too many people who regard themselves as pro-life care only about life when it's still in a woman's womb, but less or not at all once it comes out of the woman's womb? Okay, I'm seeing 2 hands up. Well, actually 3 hands up. And again, I'm asking, please, 4 hands up. Thank you, Karen. I'm asking, please stick to the question as it's been asked. Wendith, I see your hand up. Are you ready to talk?
Yeah, sure. I came out of circles that were pro-choice. I always felt a little ambiguous about it before I was ever able to form a full opinion. To try to just answer it as generally as possible, I think there's a couple of things to consider. There are what I call moderate pro-life people who are not, killing abortion doctors and protesting outside of clinics. They're not doing that, vigilante, if you would. But they have a sense of responsibility, and they will work toward, donating their time at crisis pregnancy centers. They work toward, trying to help. There are groups of people who do work toward trying to create spaces of support for parents. So they do believe in supporting the children after they're born. But I think that there's different conversations to be had with these people. And part of it is understanding where somebody falls. Some people are solely on the personal responsibility. So we may view them as not caring about the child after the fact, but really at the end of the day, they look at this as, you did a thing for the sake of like birth control or something like that. You did a thing, and now the reaction or consequences or whatever word you want to use is now you have a child, and now you need to take care of that child or find a spot for that child. They find that abortion is a punishment to the child. So I think also generalizing where people stand in the pro-life movement is dangerous, and it does hurt conversations, because I think, like, to that tweet, there are people who genuinely have never heard of reasons for abortion, partly because of the circles they follow. So they've never heard of some of these other reasons for people to have abortion. And I know there's other hands up, so I'll stop, but I think the important thing is just to learn to try to listen to people outside of sort of.
Okay, we've lost you there, Wendith. Well, I feel like a radio talk show host. Trying to be reasonable here. I would never, ever, make it for any length of time. Advertisers would absolutely hate me because, I'm not clickbaity enough, as they say. But Wendith, we hear you. Thank you very much. And I've actually just summarized a big piece of your contribution in the chat for people to be thinking about. So thank you. I did see Mars with his hand up, and Mars, I'll go to you next. Please be sure to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I want to piggyback a little bit on what Wendith said, as I think she pretty much summed up what I was going to say. I'll try not to sound so academic when I say this, but I think being pro-choice abortion myself, I think it is a disservice to people who go under the moniker of pro-life to say that they don't care about the child's life that happens afterwards. Because what I've noticed is that there are a lot of social policies out there that don't necessarily have a moral imperative behind them. They're just describing really mechanistic systems out there that, like, I don't want to turn this into a conversation about economics or anything like that, but like, let's say it's I'll mention it just like this, how I said in my head, like, and I'll just leave it alone. Capitalism and communism. Capitalism sounds greedy, doesn't necessarily care about the people involved, no moral charge behind that system. It results in people in higher standards of living around the world. Now, there may not be ideas out there that are directly meant towards improving someone's life or whatnot. Like when Wenda was saying about, like, you know, once a child is born, we want to give that child the chance to enter the world, and what happens afterwards is up to the people around him or her to give it a life worth living. But a lot of the policies that are around that may be maybe more geared towards responsibility rather than direct compassion, but that doesn't necessarily mean people don't care. Yet the overall intention may be good, even if it's not overtly compassionate. So I wouldn't classify people in that regard, say pro-life people don't care. I think there's a spectrum between that have to be considered carefully, whether it's directly intentional or not.
Great, thank you, Mars. Jennifer tells me that Bill and Larry have had their hands up for a bit. Here's what I'm going to do. Let's try to keep our interventions to about 30 seconds or less. So with that, Bill, over to you, then to Larry, then to Karen, and then to Lisa.
I think I'd better return with my question, because we're responding specifically, as Wendeth just said, to the question you reminded us. I have a other kind of comment I care about, but I'd rather wait.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. Over to you, Larry.
Yeah, thanks, Irshad. Actually, I was going to ask a question about buffalo, but while we're on this, this topic, I'm definitely pro-life, but I used to feel like there's certain things that just should be off the table for conversation, right? Like we've got Roe versus Wade, we've got this and that, and let's just move past it. Let's stop having that discussion. But there's been a lot of banter on Twitter and social media, and it just makes you realize that, like someone else said, there's just some people that don't know some of these conversations, don't know some of the reasons, like you shared, or like the earlier commenter shared. So I mean, I think it's important that we maybe always have these conversations so that we can be reminded of why these laws exist.
Yeah, and I want to just make clear, for me, I think it's important to have these conversations, not to stake out hard and fast positions, but rather to appreciate that life is complicated, life. And so to be pro-life should also involve understanding that circumstances are rarely very straightforward, are rarely very simple. And regardless of, what position anybody is taking, life is rarely straightforward for someone who is pro-life, as they would see it, as well as for someone who is pro-choice. So let's start maybe with each other's lives, right? The lives that already exist. Kind of pay homage to the lives that already exist before deciding that one or the other is evil for taking a position on a life that hasn't yet emerged from a human body. Karen, 30 seconds. Karen and Victoria, I'm looking at you.
I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, I thought you did. I apologize, Karen. I'm going to skip that.
Larry's had his hand up for an awfully long time.
Yes, and we just heard from him, Karen.
We've got
Oh,
I'm
Lisa.
sorry.
Okay, so
Lisa
next
and
is
Rich.
Lisa. Next is Lisa.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, this has been an issue for me that I actually have felt a gray area. Not many people feel a gray area on this issue, but I always have. In my 20s, I was working for Democratic congressional candidates, and we were at a state fair, and we were at the NARAL booth, and the pro-life booth was down the hall.
And NARAL refers to, just for everybody's understanding?
National Abortion Rights Action League. So we were on the pro-choice side. And I remember my 20-something friends, also involved in Democratic politics at the time, just being ruthless in their criticism. And I didn't say anything. But my thought was, and this is still my thought today, that, you know, these are people who really believe that a child is being killed. And I used to say, and it seems kind of harsh and inappropriate today, but wouldn't most of us take a bullet for a child? And it makes me want to cry saying that today. But at that time, it's like I wanted to try to understand how these friends of mine could have zero empathy or even an interest in understanding that, yeah, people have this a view that that abortion is killing a child. I can resonate with that idea, even though I don't necessarily hold it. It doesn't make me pro-life politically. But I just bring that up because I think it's so important to really try to understand why somebody, you know, holds the view that they do and not just automatically judging it.
Right. That why, thank you, Lisa. You know, asking why is crucial, because asking it sincerely, hey, not as a, you know, sarcastic maneuver to shut down an emerging conversation, but asking it from a place of curiosity rather than judgment will give you a word, one of my favorite words of all, and that is context. Context. I often say, even to my own team, that when someone knows your why, they are more amenable to hearing your what. And the more context you can provide, the more your listener will appreciate the humanity behind the position. Context. Now, I want to exercise executive privilege. We've had a good, 30 minutes on pro-life, pro-choice. I'd like to move on to some other issues. And those with their hands up still, please ensure that your hands are up because you have something else that you'd like to raise. So with that in mind, let me start with Bill, because I know, Bill, that you gave up your spot so we could come back to you later. Go ahead.
I worry a bit in this kind of really helpful conversation that we're nonetheless begging a question, which is having the conversation at all. I'm increasingly finding that people are very impatient with anything that threatens complexity or nuance. They want to stay away from so much arguing these days, polarized, et cetera. And so I don't know whether to call it compassion fatigue or some kind of interest fatigue or something, where people are just so full of so much that's conflictual. Please, let's not go there. It's as though they're saying, talk about the weather or something, or Bill, I'm glad to see you. Where have you been? But so I find some frustration around that. although I'm a nice guy, and sometimes I find a way around it, especially if I can get into their backstory, because that gets them talking. But, you know, they can sort of tell this is a serious thing and they're tired of serious. That's all the news is plain crisis, trouble, commotion, death, murder. No, I've had it, they say, in effect. So I'm just confessing a frustration. I don't think there's any real answer to what I'm saying, except, well, yeah, sounds familiar.
Well, I love your point that you managed to open up conversations by asking about people's backstories. Fact is, we human beings love to talk about ourselves.
Yeah.
We do. That's just true. And in asking people about their lives, their experiences, you're showing that you care, which is quite frankly rare today.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is.
And in showing that you care, I'll just make one final point here, Bill. In showing that you care, you're also establishing trust. So that down the road, if in fact, some of the more heavy issues come up, you've built a relationship.
Yeah.
And through that relationship, most people will remember you don't engage to play gotcha.
Yeah.
You engage because you care.
Yeah. I care and I'm curious. I'll close with this, that I love your constant reference to labels and the danger of labeling people. Despite the fact that I know that cognitively, I tend to jump to conclusions about where people are coming from. And I know I have an issue that way. So I'm curious to find out, wait, Bill, don't jump to find out where Dick is coming from. And your thing about backstory, that can really help, especially if one's really curious. For me, that's not so much a virtue as a necessity, because I know I jump to conclusions all over the place, no matter what I'm saying now.
Thank you for your intellectual honesty.
Thank you.
I did see somebody else with their hand up. I know that Larry wanted to bring up something about Buffalo, and we'll go to him in just a moment. But was there somebody whose hand was up at the same time as Bill's was and would like to raise another issue? Okay, so Larry, back to you and Buffalo. Spill.
Well, thanks, Irshad. First, I just wanted to say that I see Mumtaz is back on here, and it's so nice to see her.
Well,
I hope we hear from her before we go, because it's
but
I've heard so many stories.
That's not my mother. I can tell you now.
Oh, really?
Mumtaz, when you were still figuring
That's
out
hilarious.
your audio, I was telling the group in this Zoom room, I hope that's not my mother, because I'm going to be talking about my mother tonight. Her name, of course, is Mumtaz.
Oh, yes,
So
yes.
Mumtaz Mia, thank you for joining us, and thank you for not being my mother.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So Buffalo, I mean, it's tough. I had family who grew up in Buffalo, and it's fairly close to Hamilton where I am. And you know, you follow the comments online, and the tough ones to see, especially for us who are you know, fallen in love with moral courage, and your book and you know, it talks against maybe the issues with CRT, is that you see a lot of people almost hating on anybody who's against CRT, or at least, you know, as you say, Irshad, about it being one single lens to look at an issue, and you know, they're pretty angry and pretty, you know, if you're against CRT, then you're part of the problem. And what is your, you know, every time these kind of issues come up, it just gets brought up again, and it's you know, you feel a little guilt. You don't want to be against a solution to a more kind of, I don't know, a better society, but I'm not sure what your thoughts are.
So Larry, is there a question in this?
Yeah, just, you know, like a lot of people's first kind of comments are, if you're against CRT after what happened in Buffalo, then you're part of the problem, right?
Gotcha. And are you asking me what my position is?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of know from reading your book, but I mean, how do you what do you say to that? You know, when you're speaking against it in public, and then on the other hand, people are saying that, you know.
Yeah, yeah. So somebody helpfully has asked in the chat, CRT? Question mark. Remember, folks, when we use acronyms, whether it's NARAL or CRT,
Yeah.
we assume that people know what we're talking about, and that's another assumption we need to let go of. So CRT refers to something called critical race theory. Now, what is that? This is a school of thought that says, in essence, racism is so deeply embedded in the structures of these United States, and many would argue of Canada and other parts of the Western world, that laws are not enough. We need to do more. And I happen to agree with that position. The way somebody described it to me, by the way, some time ago, really resonated. And frankly, given what happened in Texas today with the school shooting, this analogy I'm about to tell you may also, kind of sketch a bigger picture. The way critical race theory was explained to me years ago was this: Irshad, suppose there's a law against bringing a gun into a bank. And I bring a gun into a bank, but it's not visible. It's concealed under my t-shirt. Have I broken the law? I haven't used the gun. I haven't threatened anybody with it, at least not from my perspective. Have I broken the law? The answer, of course, is yes, because the law states you cannot bring a gun into a bank, period. There are so many laws on the books in the United States, Canada, and other places against racism. And yet, racism persists. By no means the kind and the depth that existed during Rosa Parks' time, and after her, Martin Luther King Jr.'s time. For anybody to suggest that, progress hasn't been made since then, it's just fool's talk. But racism does persist. And Buffalo is only the latest and most extreme example. You don't need to go to those extremes to know the truth of racism's continued existence. So advocates of critical race theory say exactly because racism persists, despite so many laws against it, we need to do more. Where I part company with advocates of CRT is in what more we do. Do we label all white people oppressors and all so-called people of color as oppressed? Do we define children according to their complexion and further these days, their gender identity and religion and other labels which capture maybe one part of what it is to be human, but certainly not everything of what it is to be human? That is where I believe advocates of CRT fall into a trap of their own making. Audre Lorde, and I'm going to use labels here, the Black lesbian radical poet of the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s, famously said that you cannot dismantle the master's house by using the master's tools. And the same, I think, applies in this case. The us versus them framework that led to racism and other forms of discrimination in the first place cannot undo racism and other forms of discrimination. An entirely different mindset will be needed to outwit and eventually defeat the either or mindset. And that entirely different mindset is the both and lens. This is a huge concept in the teaching of moral courage, both and. And it comes nicely back to the story that I told at the top of this chai chat. One can be conventionally pro-life, as in pro-birth, and at the same time hear someone who's pro-choice and learn from them. These two are very different people. It stands to reason that the pro-life individual will not come up with thoughts that the pro-choice individual will, because they think differently. So of course, pro-life individual has something to learn from the pro-choice individual. Similarly, vice versa. So even as you hear your other, hearing does not mean having to agree with. And so, for example, you can hear the story of my mother and still say, you know, I've reflected on it, and on balance, I'm still traditionally pro-life. And Irshad, you've given me something to think about that I wouldn't have come up with on my own. That's the both and paradigm. So you can see, it doesn't ask anybody to dilute their convictions, compromise their values, or abandon their ideals. The both and lens allows us, if we still have integrity doing this, to stand our ground and create common ground at the same time. I both think that I have the better position, and you've given me something new to think about. What does that take away from anybody? That's where advocates of CRT go wrong. They remain stuck in the either or trap. Either you follow their prescription for how to bring justice to society, or you're complicit in the white supremacy that laid waste to too many Black folks in Buffalo. No, life is not absolutely black and white. And if you believe it is, in the name of social justice, to my mind, you're reaffirming the either or mindset of the white supremacist who blew away a bunch of innocent people. I might be wrong, and I would very much invite you to push back if you believe I am wrong about that, because I have something to learn. So on that note, I see two hands up. One is Seamus Sullivan and one is Rich Minder. And I will ask you, each of you, to address where you think I have gone wrong, if you think I have gone wrong. If you don't think I've gone wrong, we'll get to you a little bit later. Okay, with that, Seamus, you go first.
Hi, thank you. I had something I wanted to share in my head, which is about school shootings and about the racial element, but it wasn't specifically in reaction to like your CRT.
Okay, so can I put you on hold?
I was just going to say I'm happy to wait.
Brilliant. I promise I will come back to you, Seamus, just as I came back to Bill. Rich, you got something to push back on?
Well, it's not so much pushing back. I agree with what you said, I think. I think what I wonder about is if some of what might explain what we saw in Buffalo and in Charleston and so forth is more of a struggle for a struggle between identities. I mean, somebody feeling as though their identity is being sacrificed in a pluralistic society. They're finding that their identity is at risk of losing the same level of dignity that it had before, or that it doesn't get as much dignity in the public square as somebody else's, or that it's just confusing because there's so many identities struggling for dignity in the public square that that causes a certain kind of identity crisis and angst in which one is vulnerable to the kind of arguments that maybe make it more difficult to engage in civil discourse, because you're just struggling to make sure that your identity just receives the same level of dignity in the public square as somebody else's. And so I mean, it's not that I disagree with you, but I wonder if something deeper is going on than just how.
Oh, definitely, Rich. And listen, from the research that I've done, I can tell you that something deeper is going on. And it's even deeper than what I'm about to explain. But I'll reaffirm your point. Robert Putnam is a famous sociologist. He became famous writing a book many years ago called Bowling Alone, in which he observed and in many ways predicted the loneliness that is now epidemic in America and in many other parts of the world for sure. But he wrote about American society. Robert Putnam recently, by which I mean around 2 years ago, came out with a study in which he found that it is not so much demographic change in and of itself that tends to radicalize some white people. Rather, it is the pace of that demographic change. And he said that when people get scared, they retreat into their shells and act like turtles. They become isolated. They self-isolate. And that in and of itself also contributes to feelings of paranoia, of threat, of being alone to the point of being defenseless. It's what scientists call a cognitive illusion, meaning it's a trick that the mind plays on us out of fear. But Robert Putnam's point was, it would be inaccurate to say that white people who fear demographic change even a little bit are white supremacists. It is that, like all people, they are scared, those who are scared, by the notion that their identity might now be take a backseat to everybody else's. And then when you have the constant cultural drumbeat trashing white people and sympathizing with people of color, it then feels even more like, okay, this is not just demographic change. This really is the suppression of one identity to elevate another. Once again, the either or mindset, the us versus them mindset. And so you can see that on one hand, it is the fear that some white people have of the pace of change, combined with the noise of the culture that feels like it is constantly, remorselessly, relentlessly mocking white people. And that's how demographic change then oxidizes into feelings of us against them, feelings of either or. By the way, Robert Putnam also acknowledged he was very afraid to speak about these findings because he himself worried that he would be labeled a racist. And he flirted with the idea of not coming out with the study at all. But as an academic, he felt it was necessary to inject this nuance into an otherwise stark, morally stark conversation. If you haven't heard about his study, it's because it didn't get much coverage. And that too speaks volumes.
Irshad, before you take more questions, you've got a little over 5 minutes till the end of the hour.
Thank you very much, Jen. Look, I want to respect everybody's time. I'm more than happy to stick around a few minutes after the hour. Those who need to drop off, of course, please feel free to do so and sign up to our newsletter. Go to moralcourage.com/newsletter in order to subscribe so that you then get the notification about when the next chit-chat will be. So I'm not logging off now, but I do want to say to those who are, thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you at the next chit-chat. With that said, I do see now 3 hands up, one of which is Seamus. We also have Lori and we have Mumtaz. And so let me go back to Seamus. Seamus, if you'd like to raise a new issue as you had planned to, and then Mumtaz, you'll be next. And Lori, if you're still around, we'll go to you after Mumtaz. Go ahead, Seamus.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm here in Vancouver, Canada, and pleasure to be here, my first one. And it's funny because even in this space where you create such a comfortable atmosphere, I'm still like, oh, what if I say the wrong thing? And what if I get perceived a certain way? So I'm just acknowledging that nervousness.
Thank you.
So I was going to, thank you. I was going to address the school shooting, just not the CRT part.
Sure.
And thank you for mentioning what the acronym means, because those of us in Canada sometimes don't know all of them. Yeah, I was just reading about the latest school shooting today, the one in Texas, and I saw the name of the suspect, which looks very much like a Latino name. I don't know much. I don't know anything else about the shooter. And it was making me reflect on every time there's a school shooting, there's this kind of politicization that comes through where certain friends of mine who are also on the left, but who are much more quote unquote sort of attached to some of the woke stuff, will point out there's another white shooter. There's another white shooter, where it becomes this narrative that it's always a white shooter. And obviously, as we've just discussed with the Buffalo shooting, there's often a racial element. The big awful shooting in the Montreal University in the late 80s was misogyny was a driver, and there's often these other factors. But I just think we lose something when there's this immediate labeling that it's a white male problem. I think the only label for me that seems to really apply pretty universally is that it's a male problem, which is again a stereotype, but it seems like it's 99% of the time it's a male.
You're right about that. I've recently done some very I'm going to say cutting edge research into this very issue, and you're absolutely right. The vast majority, 99+ percent of mass shooters are male.
Yeah, and it's thank you for adding that, because I didn't know the stat, but I feel like most of us would think that's the way it is, because that's what it certainly seems to be. But I think that the ethnicity and the background and the religion and stuff like that, there is some variety, and maybe the stats also show that 80% of them are white men. I don't know, but I just think that automatically putting that racial label on it, it cheapens and reduces the issue. Violence around the world is a male issue, is what I believe, whether it's gun violence or gang violence or whatever. And there's something there that needs to be addressed if we're going to reduce it down to one demographic of people.
Right, right.
So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Sean. And precisely because I've done, the research I just alluded to very recently, I can tell you all that my research suggests about 60% of mass shooters in America now are white men. So it's not even close to 100%, 60%. And I think that's just worth keeping in mind. But Sean is 110% right, that 99% plus of mass shooters that we know of are men. Mumtaz?
Hey, Irshad, can you hear me?
I can. Thank you for joining
Great.
us. I know of you from social media, and now I see you, and I'm so pleased that you've joined us tonight.
No, lovely to be here. It's my first one, so I'm really glad to be here. And hello, everybody. I'm joining in from Argentina, a little village just outside of Rosario in Argentina. But I am from Africa. So I'm looking at this from a very different angle. And without naming names, I work for an international organization that up until a couple of years ago, you couldn't even say the words race or racism in the corridors. But knowing that it's entrenched into the system, so talking about critical race theory and systemic racism, it's right there in your face. But it's also more about the culture of the organization. So I am a Malawian Black woman, South Asian African heritage. I get into this system and I'm expected to be a certain way that the system requires of me, but nobody questions where this culture is coming from, whose culture is this, and what does that mean for me and for the people we serve, who are primarily people from the global South, from a totally different culture and way of thinking. So these are deep conversations we are having within this, and I am leading in my agency, I'm leading this work on culture and ending racism. And it's just deep things that are going to take generations to get to the bottom of, to start addressing. But I believe that if we can do, and what I am trying to do within my space is to take those few steps forward. So even just starting to talk about it and to acknowledge and to have our leaders acknowledge that racism exists in the organization, for me, it's already a huge step forward. And so it's, the little steps we can take now for the next generation to pick up and continue, but it's going to take generations for this to even, start getting somewhere where we can all be seen and be able to live as equal in this world.
Yeah, I thank you so much for that contribution, Mumtaz. It will take generations. And, I'm going to say you're probably more optimistic than I am. And here's why. I don't mean to say that because it will take generations, why bother? Gosh, you know me enough to know that, oh no, I bother. What makes me hopeful but not optimistic is that all human beings have a tendency to discriminate. And one of the big illusions in the work of anti-racism, and I mean that generically, not as a politicized movement, anti-racism, but generically, is that it assumes that whoever is the target of racism, by definition, cannot be racist in turn. That's simply not true. My family and I, we were exiled from Uganda in East Africa by a military dictator who happened to be a Black man. And who learned some of his ruthlessness at the hands of the colonial powers. But instead of pulling a Mandela and reforming that ruthlessness for a new day for Africa, he replicated it. And this time against people who were not as Black as he would like them to be, namely people who looked like me. I bring this up because even as you are doing your necessary work, and God bless you for it, in bringing to light the lack of equal treatment of people within your organization, I hope that you'll do it in a way that acknowledges that precisely because we're all human, we all have the capacity to become oppressors, even when we start from a place of being oppressed. And may that be the reminder we need to recognize that at the end of the day, this is not about who's white and who's Black, or who's a person of color and who's not. It's really about who comes from that either or mindset and who's willing to evolve into a both and paradigm. One that dignifies the other, whoever the other is in any given situation, even when there is a right position to be taken. So, thank you, Mumtaz. It is 5 past the hour, and I'll take any further questions before I wrap it up. Mars, I see you. Go for it.
Hey, Irshad, I had one question for you. It's like something that I've tried to accomplish a little bit more in my life. I'm very much against racism myself. I consider myself someone who's center left, but I am very anti-CRT because of that strict dichotomy it puts out to everybody, like you mentioned. Talking to people about this kind of subject, and among others, it's a very dicey scenario. You know, I read your book, I love it, and something I try to do is almost always extend an olive branch to somebody who disagrees. But I've noticed that there are some people who are determined to take you at your worst possible who are willing to assume the worst about you, no matter what you say or how carefully you say it. Yeah. What do you do in that kind of circumstance when you open up those lines of dialogue? Because the ones in which I persisted forward in those areas, I more often than not end up with egg on my face. Mm. And the other alternative, and this is bad on my part, I tend to go nuclear, which is also not good. What would you do in those circumstances, and how do you practice it?
Yeah. I do something right away, even before it reaches the point where I realize my good faith is not being reciprocated. And what I do right away, Mars, is I remind myself, the reason I'm entering this conversation, this interaction, is not to change the other's mind. Because if that's my intention, first of all, I'm going to be severely disappointed when it doesn't happen. And the reason it's not going to happen is that my intention to change the other's mind will seduce me to play that other person. I'll be striving to manipulate that other person in order to bring them on side. Well, guess what? I don't like to be played. I'll bet you don't like being played. And that other person doesn't like being played. And when they sniff it out, which more often than not they will, whatever power I had, whatever credibility I had, entering the conversation, gone. Because they know I'm here to play a game with them. So, to be more clear, what I do, even before I enter any kind of an interaction where I think there might be disagreement is I remind myself, what is my purpose here? And my purpose, quite simply, is to understand where the other is coming from. Understand. Not push back, not critique, not poke holes. Just understand. And what that further means is when I ask my questions, I'm asking them from a genuine place of curiosity because I want to understand more. And if I feel like, okay, I've given this person a fair hearing, now it's time for me to get a fair hearing. If that's where you sometimes find yourself like, okay, now I've got to state where I'm coming from, by all means, you can say, hey, man, thank you so much for giving me all of that information and providing me with that context. It helps me appreciate why you believe what you believe. I get it better now than I did at the start of our conversation. So thanks for that. Do you mind if I now explain some of my context, where I'm coming from? When approached that way, Mars, my experience is that most people will say, oh, yeah, of course, no, go ahead. Now, on that rare occasion, the other will say, nah, I don't really give a damn where you're coming from. I'm good. Does that mean you've got egg on your face? No, not at all. Because remember, you weren't in this to change their mind or to win. You were in this to understand. And if you feel that your effort has gotten you to understand a little bit better where they're coming from, mission accomplished, friend. What you can't say then, in the case where you feel like you've just got egg on your face, where you've been sucker punched is, okay, well, when you're ready to give me the hearing that I've given you, let me know. We'll pick it up where we left off. And you move on. And you know what you've just done right there? By not letting them get under your skin, by not letting them make you go nuclear, you have surprised them. You see, we live in a culture today, an us against them culture, an either or culture, where the expected response is to counterpunch, is to lash back, is to go nuclear. If I want to get under your skin, Mars, and that's how you react to me, I frankly busted you. I see your true colors. I knew that's what you were going to do. And, I got you, baby. You have not surprised me. But when you hold fast to your own integrity, integrity by which I mean you went into this to understand, not to change their mind or not to win, but to understand. When you know that you have come out with a better understanding of why they believe what they believe, you've won. That's the victory. And by letting them know that you're open to picking up where we're going to leave off, once they're ready to give you a hearing, giving them a response, not a reaction. And that response, I guarantee you, will make them think. When they're off script, in their private moments, when they don't need to be on message, they will remember the respect with which you treated them. And they may never come back to you, Mars, and say, man, I know how you made me feel. You didn't humiliate me. And listen, I'm ready to talk again. They may never come back to you with that kind of a response. That's okay. You will have made them think. And it goes back to something that I wanted to see in the responses to the tweet about my mother. Remember I said a lot of the folks who responded said, I need to think about this more. That was the response I was hoping for. That is a victory today. It's not easy, I know. Believe me, I know. But it's possible. And that's obviously what we teach at Moral Courage is how you can make this kind of emotional self-regulation and therefore emotional intelligence a habit. Not just skills that you rely on when it's convenient, no, because that's too easy to forget those skills, but rather make them your modus operandi. Make those skills just how you roll. Because when they are a habit, they're a no-brainer. And in being a no-brainer, you literally disarm that primitive part of the brain that wants to see the other's rebuff as a threat. You take control of your ego, man. And you leave the other thinking.
Thank you.
Thank you. And on that note, I want to thank you all for staying with me and not just joining me. I hope to see you next time. And keep engaging, everybody. But engage your inner conversation as much as your outer one. Peace.